Grüß, willkommen in einem Figurenspiel. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 49 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case I'll be discussing methods to speed up the setup process of a figure game. One of the rather annoying issues that all figure games have to face is the time required to set up a game. If you turn up at a club and wish to fit 2 games in a day, or to comfortably fit a single game within a day, the last thing you wish to do is to spend an hour or more setting up. The pack-up time is also a factor. However, players can simply pack their figures as quickly as possible in any manner they wish, and the following day reorganise their figures in the boxes and their terrain, etc., and their rules as required. So while this is a factor, it is not as significant as the effort and time required to set up a game. Of course, it goes without saying that games which can be set up for several days at someone's house does not really have this issue. In this case, if the setup takes several days, it's not an issue, as long as when the gamers arrive they can get stuck into gaming as quickly as possible, we are okay. Of course, the person that actually lives in the house where the game needs to be set up will have some work to do the day or days beforehand, but it's assumed that if they're allowing a game to be set up for many days, they are a true enthusiast. On the other hand, if you're married, like I am, you may not be allowed to set up a game for several days in your house. In that case, setup time can still be a factor. I often have games in my garage, but this requires me to wake up nice and early so I can set up everything before 9 AM. This is not a real major issue, but reducing this time is always a positive, as it allows me to have breakfast before my gaming buddies turn up. Let's now go through all the setup factors that you need to consider. The first setup factor is purely physical, getting the tables, unfolding them and arranging them as you require. I tend to prefer 3 standard size fold-out tables, 2 for the playing area and 1 for the other stuff required for a game. If playing at a club, you need to use whatever is available. However, when playing at home, I have found a number of rather useful folding tables. A folding table of this type can be easy to store and easy to set up. I have 3 tables similar to this, 2 of which are always folded up until I need them, and the third I leave set up. These tables are normally about 70 to 80 centimetres deep and 180 centimetres long. You can get larger tables, but I found the additional weight and size an issue, and I would not be able to pack them into the boot of my rather old and small Audi sedan. Depending on how large the playing area is, I normally deploy my tables in this manner for large games. The table on the side, that's the right, contains my boxes of figures, terrains, rules, charts and tables. The 2 tables on the left is used for the actual playing area. This gives me an area of 180 centimetres by 160 centimetres. If you need a very large playing area, the tables can be arranged in this manner. This gives me an area of 1.8 metres deep by 2.4 metres wide. Anything larger than this tends to be simply too large for a game. At least that's what I've discovered, particularly considering I cannot leave my playing area set up over many days because my car needs to live in the garage. As I use a reasonably solid separate playing area for my games, I often use this arrangement. In this case, the playing area is only 80 centimetres deep, but I can now place a 3x4 MDF sheet on this to act as my playing area. It overhangs each end, but it tends to work as long as the MDF sheets, are reasonably solid. There are many different types of arrangements players can adopt depending on the game required. This only shows some of the ones that I particularly use. As I get older, I discover that standing for 8 hours straight is not very pleasant, so you need chairs. And simple folding chairs of this nature is also easy to store and easy to deploy. I tend to find setting up the tables and chairs take no more than 5 to 15 minutes, depending on how hurried I am. Once I set up the tables, I typically cover my playing areas and even the side tables with green felt. I do this to ensure my MDF playing area stays solidly on the playing area and does not slip around, because obviously my tables have a plastic top or even at a club, normally it's a polished wooden clop or melanite top, which is rather slippery. Players who use felt as their playing area would do this by default, and that's all they would ever use. I also like placing green felt on the side table as it looks and feels nicer. However, this is not really necessary. Once I have my tables all set up and the green felt placed on it, I then place my playing areas on the felt covered tables. I typically use two 2x3 foot 3mm thick MDF sheets, which have been covered with woodland fine turf, as you can see here. The main reason I do this is that it makes setup time very quick, as well as looking reasonably good. There are many different types of playing area types. A pre-printed playing mat is another very good solution, and in that case, because the base tends to be rubber, you don't need to put felt on because it sticks quite nicely onto your table. In this case that you can see here, I used 30cm square cork tiles, which I finally discovered is not really as good as my MDF solution or a pre-printed playing mat. Because in this case, the tiles don't really look as good because of lines everywhere, and it takes a surprisingly large amount of time to set up. I've covered playing areas and terrains in many of my previous videos, so I'm not going to go into excessive detail, but one critical factor you need to consider is how quickly can you set up the playing area, that is with terrain. Whatever solution you select, make sure you consider how quickly you can set up your playing area using whatever solution that you've selected, obviously. Of course, the other critical factor is the terrain which fits on top of the playing area. Terrains is very rules dependent, so I'm only going to be providing some general guidelines. But one guideline that I always follow is to ensure that I can quickly and easily deploy the terrain pieces onto my playing area. In this case, I have standard terrain sizes for hills and woods, which I can quickly place as I wish. The roads and streams are embedded, so require zero setup time. Finally, the built-up areas also use a standard size, which I can then quickly deploy as required. One interesting point is, because I embed my roads, one big advantage I have with embedded roads is that I normally place my built-up areas on the roads, which make placing the BUAs a lot simpler. The streams also help with other terrains. I typically place woods around the streams and then in between the streams, hills, because that seems reasonable. I mean, there are many advantages with having embedded roads and rivers. This is one. Of course, the disadvantage is you lack flexibility. Now, the other issue is, while physically placing the terrain can be made as simple as possible, depending on the rules, this can be more complex or less complex than what I've particularly indicated. Some rules have very complex terrain setup processes, and if that's what the rules require, you have to follow those processes and you have to take up the time accordingly. However, what I tend to do these days is have one player to create a pre-deployed playing area. Thus, a player can quickly create a playing area and then the opposing player can select which side they wish to play. It makes it really quick. Historical scenarios tend to also be rather good, as in this case the playing area is defined in the scenario details. However, if the terrain placement is complex, even for historical scenarios, this can be rather time consuming, so some balance needs to be considered. Now we come to what can often be the biggest issue, the force mix you deploy on the playing area. If playing a historical scenario with predefined forces, the force mixes can be arranged the day before a game. This can allow for very quick up setup times and is one reason why I used to play a lot of historical scenarios in the past. It just made the whole setup process so much simpler. On the other hand, when you play historical scenarios, once you've played the same scenario about half a dozen times, I tend to find it's pretty much played out. Thus, I like playing ad hoc games. Now, when you play ad hoc games, the force mix deployment can be a lot more difficult. If using army lists, each player can build out their force mixes the day before a game. This is a common system and it works quite well. For example, it's used extensively in the Ancients world, particularly DBMM. The only issue with a points-based system is, and particularly if it's an ad hoc game, is if you need variable force mix arrival times, or if the game is truly ad hoc, which means no one has prepared anything the day before. Let's first look at truly ad hoc games, which are games which have no prior preparation. This could be gamers that meet at a club deciding to try a game on a whim, for example. This type of game is not very common with figure gamers, but if your rules allow you to have a game within a 2 to 3 hour period, it's certainly something which could occur and does occur if it's mechanically or physically possible. Currently, DBA or DBN are the best examples of such a set of rules. In this case, this becomes viable because the army lists are so simple. Each player, for example, gets 12 points and an army list which provides only minimal variability. Two players can quickly select or create an army and create an army list within 10 minutes, so it's not an issue creating a force mix. Flames of War may also apply in this case, although those rules achieve this with the use of a rather extensive range of scenario books. But as a rule, these rules do not support games with variable reinforcements. That is, how do you have an ad hoc game when you have an initial force mix and different stuff comes in at different times? This becomes extremely difficult to determine your force mixes because, of course, having all your stuff at the beginning gives you a big advantage compared with having stuff coming in as reinforcements. So how do you adjust your victory points? Let's now look at variable force mix arrival schedules in more detail. This does not normally impact ancient games, but many Napoleonics, World War II and Cold War scenarios will often have variable forces coming in at different times. And actually, to have a good game, you need to have this occur. Apart from the fact that historically it did occur, having variable force mixes allows different players to attack and defend at different times. Now, the figures required for such a game may not be able to be defined before the game actually occurs or the prior day. One way of having variable reinforcements in is having some kind of random card-based ad hoc system where players randomly select cards before the game and deploy them in a variety of different ways with the exact points impact or victory points impact indicated on the card. If you're using such a card-based system, the problem is automatically resolved as the forces to be used are printed on the card. A player only needs to remove the required elements from whatever storage solution the player is using in order to deploy the forces. So no issue here if you have some form of card-based ad hoc scenario system. If the variable force mixes and force mix arrivals are based on simple points only, which would then need to be converted into figures, then there is an issue. Thus, in this case, a player randomly or in a variable manner decides to deploy 100 points at the start, 50 points and 75 points respectively at different points in the game, that then you would need to convert those points into figures. This type of system would dramatically increase the time to set up as both players would need to start converting points to figures before the game. Thus, it's not a good idea, and I've basically very rarely ever seen this system work or used out there in the real world. To ensure rapid setup, it's important that each player has a simple and clean way of determining what force mixes they are going to deploy before the game. This requires this information being printed on cards or on a scenario sheet or in a book. I have no doubt there are many other different options apart from the ones that I've just indicated to create ad hoc scenarios or games. However, you need in all these systems some quickly referenced material or list or chart that allows you to deploy these forces quickly, no matter what kind of system you have to use. The first classic example that I can think of is a historical scenario, such as this one for Age of Eagles. These provide the full details of start forces, reinforcements, and the playing area, which really makes it simple. If you're using a random or variable scenario system which uses cards to determine the force mixes, the forces to be deployed need to be detailed on the cards, as you can see here. Players should not be expected to create their forces using a point system just before the game unless the system is very simple as it is with, let's say, DBA and DBN. If you're using a more complex point-based system such as DBM, players need a set of standard army lists at various points totals. In this case, we have a 200-point force mix, which players could use to play a game with a Kadesh flavour, for example. In this case, the point system is pure DBMM, but the rules that I'm using for these cards are P17CW, or pre-17th century warfare rules, which is the SPI pre-stag game converted for figure gamings. Now, in this case, because I use those rules, the cards that you see here contain values which are not used in DBMM. It's only shown as an example. In addition to a 200 point per side army list or card, the reverse of each of these cards contain a 300 point army list, and you could probably create additional cards for 400 and 500 points. I normally don't prefer games of that size, but that's certainly an option. I've created these army lists in the form of large cards, and I possess a large number of different pairings of forces. This allows me to quickly create a game, assuming I've brought my figures with me, with any random player that happens to be at the club at that time. Now we come to how you store your figures. Every player has their own system, but whatever system you use, it's important you can quickly find the correct elements from your storage solution when you need them. This will allow you to quickly place the required elements on the playing area as you're reading whatever document you're using to determine your force mix. Well, what I've provided in this video is certainly not extensive, and there are many other areas or things that you should consider in order to speed up game setup time. These are some of the main ideas players should consider in order to allow them to quickly set up a game. Quick games are common in the world of board gaming, but tend to not be so common for figure games, particularly before DBA came out. If the rules support quick games, which is a very popular thing these days, I mean, all you have to do is look at the prevalence of skirmish rules, etc., which is a classic example of a quick game. Players in that case should do everything they can to ensure the setup time period does not negate the benefit of having a quick play set of rules. This allows you to have multiple games in a day if you so desire, or at least allows you to have a very leisurely game which will actually end within a day, with lots of time at each end, so the players can discuss which tactic they did that was good or bad, or what they should have done or what they should not have done. Anyway, I've also discovered as I get older, once I hit about 4 hours of solid gaming, I need a nap. Perhaps if you're younger, that's not a constraint, but it's certainly a constraint with me. And so we come once again to an end of one of my videos, in this case part 49 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case analysing methods to speed up the setup process of figure gaming. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.